Hello, friends, and welcome to The Membership, a podcast about the life and work of Wendell Berry, the Kentucky farmer, poet, novelist, essayist, and activist. My name is John Pattison, and I'm joined, as always, by my two fellow members.
This is Tim Wasson.
This is Jason Hardy.
Hey, guys, how are you doing?
Doing all right.
Yeah, good.
Well, on this episode, we're heading back into fiction. And specifically, we're discussing two short stories. Fly Away Breath is the first one, and the second one is A Consent. And they're both relatively short. And just a reminder, the way that we're doing this, with the poetry and the nonfiction, we're reading them in the order in which they were published. But for the fiction, we're reading through it chronologically in the time in which it was set. And so these two stories, one, Fly Away Breath, is set in 1907, and A Consent is set in 1908. And if you're reading along with us, which we hope you are, just a reminder that Fly Away Breath can be found in the collection A Place and Time, and A Consent can be found in That Distant Land, and they're both in the Library of America edition, the third and fourth stories. It's a lot of information. Hope you were able to follow that. But and I should also say, too, man, this is kind of getting into the weeds a little bit, but I was surprised today when I was looking. I've been reading in the Library of America edition. I went back to look at something in That Distant Land and realized that there is a story in That Distant Land that is not in Library of America. And I bring it up because if you're reading in That Distant Land, it's going to look like we're skipping it. And also, in our last fiction episode, we talked about how there are only two short stories set in the 19th century. And this third story that is not in the Library of America is also set in the 19th century. And so we kind of talked about, first of all, like, why is it not in Library of America? And then what should we do? And among the three of us, and then some help from a Wendell Berry expert named Brother Tom Murphy, I was reminded, I'd forgotten that short story also appears in Jayber Crow. And so we think that that's why it's not in Library of America. And so we will follow the Library of America and just talk about that particular story when we get to Jayber Crow. Does that make sense to how I explain that?
Yeah,
definitely.
And what was the name of that
Okay.
one? Did you mention the name of it?
It's called, oh, thanks. Yeah, it's called Don't Send a Boy to Do a Man's Work.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, so we'll get to that in, 3 or 4 years?
Yeah.
It's about
It's about a young Athie Keith, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, so let's start with Fly Away Breath, which first appeared in the Threepenny Review in spring 2008. And, what I love about this story, one of the things I love about the story is that we get to know a little bit more about Rebecca Daw and her family. Actually, we don't really learn more about Rebecca Daw, but we learn more about her family. She was the main character in the very first short story that we discussed, The Girl in the Window. And Fly Away Breath is about her mother, Maximilla Daw. How would you pronounce that
Maximilia?
name, do you think? Maximilia?
But she went by Maxie, so
Yeah, well, or Granny Daw. We'll call her Maxie or Granny Daw
yeah.
for the rest of this discussion. So the story is actually, it's one of Andy Catlett's stories where we've talked about him before, as kind of the memory keeper for Port William, and the story starts 100 years after it's actually set, and Andy Catlett's recalling memories that actually aren't his. He's inherited them from people down through the years, and he is recalling this time 100 years earlier where Granny Daw or Maxie Daw is 92 or 93 years old, and she is on her deathbed, and she is surrounded by 4 granddaughters, including Andy Catlett's grandmother, Margaret Feltner. And she's very close to death. She's laying in bed. It's night. She is asleep. She won't actually wake up again. And as I said, she's dying, and she knows that she's dying. She says at one point that if this is dying, it's a lot better than some of the living she's known, or something, something like that. And so, they're all in this room in the house on Maxie's farm. The 4 younger women around the older woman, and it gets really quiet. And I'm struggling because I wonder how much of this I should give away, because it's such a surprise.
Yeah. So, spoiler alert, if you haven't read the story, stop now.
Yeah.
Go read the story. It's not very long.
Yeah.
And we can give the spoilers away now.
Yeah, you're right. I think I just have to go for it, right?
Yeah.
So it gets very quiet. Like they can't even hear her breath anymore, and they could kind of lean in a little bit, and just as one of them is about ready to say she's gone, Maxie lets out this breath that she's been holding, and it sounds like, and Wendleberry writes that the young women are startled backward from the bedside, each seeing in the wide open mouths and eyes of the others her own fright. One of the granddaughters accidentally knocks over a lamp, and it totters and almost falls, but one of the other granddaughters catches it. And then he says, "They stand now and look at one another. The silence has changed. The dying woman's utterance, brief as it was, spoke of a great weariness. It was the sigh of one who has been kept waiting. The sound hangs in the air as if visible, as if the lamp flame had flown upward from the wick. It stays, nothing moves, until some lattice of the air lets pass the single distant cry of an owl. Whoo, as if an answer." And then he says, Callie Knoll, one of the granddaughters, turns away, bends forward, and emits what so hard suppressed might have been a sob, but it is a laugh. And then they all laugh, at themselves, at one another, and they cannot stop. Their sense of impropriety of their laughter renews their laughter. And so they just, here's this solemn scene, this beautiful scene that he's captured, that Wendleberry has captured, and then there's this very surprising and funny and beautiful moment that took me totally by surprise when I was reading it for the first time. In fact, he even says that the young women looking at each other, flushed and wet-eyed with laughter, makes them laugh. They laugh because they are young and they are alive, and life has revealed itself to them, as it often had and often would, by surprise.
It's a great example of the Wendleberry's brand of humor. Like those, I mean, that's a very relatable. It's like a relatable situation. That kind of something inappropriate happens, one person starts laughing, and everybody can't stop laughing. But at the same time, the circumstances of it are not totally normal.
Right?
Yeah.
Person, letting out a noise after everybody thinks they're dead. It's almost like it's like National Lampoon kind of moment.
Yeah, it really is. Yeah.
Of that.
So what do you guys think of the story? Did you like it?
I enjoyed it, and I think maybe my favorite part, I think overall I enjoyed it. But when Jason first got here to record, one thought that I had was that I wasn't sure that it was. In some ways, it didn't feel like a short story, and I think it's. And I can get into this later, but because I was so fascinated by the first 5 paragraphs of it, and then the ending, where Andy Catlett's being very transparent about this is me sitting here thinking about it, because Andy Catlett being Wendleberry, it felt like we were getting a little. I'll just go into it, but it felt like to me like we were getting a little window into late life or late career Wendleberry's writing process. Like he was sitting there trying to figure out what to write, and then that part that came out was him just kind of not knowing what to write, but it was just thinking about. It starts out by saying Andy Catlett keeps in his mind a map of the country around Port William, as he has known it all his life, and as he has been told about it all his life from times and lives before his. There are moments now that he is getting old when he seems to reside in that country in his mind, even as his mind still resides in the country. I can just see and imagine Barry writing that and almost just like kind of calling out to the muses, like, I'm just going to see where this goes today. I'm not sure where this is going to go. And then he even mentions later on that this story just kind of jumps into his head, and he's kind of startled by the fact that it jumps into his head. And it's, almost like he's taking an account of actually having that moment of inspiration where the story of Maxie just all of a sudden pops into his head, like suddenly feels familiar. Well, here it is. And that's the story that he tells, and that was just fascinating to me.
Mm-hmm. And something that didn't occur to me until just now, in those first 4 or 5 paragraphs at the beginning, he talks about how quiet it is, and as his mind is moving backwards in time in the Port Williams history, he has the sounds. He mentions, he says that the sounds of the engines get quieter, and the distances get longer. And it didn't occur to me until just now that the young women were able to hear the owl call in response is maybe only possible because it was pre-engine,
Right.
That we don't have opportunities for that kind of quiet anymore. Mm-hmm. And then he even describes Maxie's death at the very end as the definitive quiet. And so it's a story about quietude. Is that a word? Quietude? It's about quietness as much as anything else.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
We also get at the beginning we get to see a little taste of the crotchety, the curmudgeony Wendell Berry side, where he just throws in, our descendants may never know such a time again when the petroleum is all burnt. How they will fare when they will depend on the neighborly wisdom, the love for the place and its genius, and the skills that they manage to revive between now and then.
Right.
Like, oh yeah, okay.
Yeah.
And then I think he even goes a little further than that, but but I just love that, where he's like, I'm just going to throw this in there because this is what I'm thinking, which I love. So
yeah, what is that? A future that we deserve to fear but cannot predict.
Yep.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think picking up on what you were saying, Tim, I mean, I feel like this story follows sort of a similar pattern to The Girl in the Window and what was the other story we read for last time? The Hurt Man, where you kind of have, I mean, the little frame narrative of Andy Catlett is something new here, but you kind of have a long buildup of background information, and then you have a little short vignette of basically a moment in the literary present, I guess. So I mean that background. I mean, I feel like it takes up more pages than the actual story of Maxie Dawes' deathbed. That doesn't really bother me. I mean, I think I enjoyed reading the background and learning about Maxie Daw, but it's just an interesting form that all of these stories that we've read seem to take. And maybe, I mean, this is a time much farther removed from, what we experience. So it may have been that he felt like he had to give a little bit more background to sort of place things in their context. But yeah.
It's been a while since I've read this novel, and maybe you guys have read it more recently, but the structure that you're describing, Jason, it reminds me of The Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, James Joyce, where he's talking about those epiphanal moments.
Yeah.
And I feel like the Rebecca Daw refusing to look away in the window, what the moment meant to Matt Feltner when the Hurt Man comes through his house and he sees his mother caring. And this moment where sort of life surprises them in the midst of oncoming death. Mm-hmm. They're brief moments, these brief moments of epiphany, and maybe by sort of working backwards to kind of set you up for those epiphanies. Maybe that's what's happening. I don't know, just a thought.
Yeah, I think that's great. I mean, I think that is. I mean, obviously these are important moments that are living on in the memories of these people that are in the story, but also the people who come after them, like Andy Catlett. I mean, I see this as, I sort of wonder if this is a story that is actually in Wendell family. I mean, it's such a interesting, little vignette that it's like it almost had to happen to someone that he heard about. Like, it sounds like a family story, right? That you have.
There's something very delicate about these stories. And it's also worth pointing out, too, that not only is Andy Catlett going back from wherever he is, 2007 or so, back to 1907. But then, as Maxie is on her deathbed, Wendell Berry takes us, or Andy Catlett, takes us even further back into Maxie's history. So we learn more about Maxie's family during the Civil War. We learn more about her son who was killed as he was leaving to join the Confederate Army. That's something that we're told about in The Girl in the Window. So he takes us back to where, she's born in 1814 or something like that. So we're going a total of 200 years into the past in the course of this one story.
This short little story. Yeah, absolutely. That, and then you hinted at that, the Civil War, some of the Civil War stories, and that was one that stuck out to me. I love when a little detail in Wendell Berry stories, you can just imagine it blooming into a full-blown story. Someday, maybe he writes it, probably not, though, but at least in your head, you just get that depth of a story. And the one I'm thinking of is when she talks about the rebel cavalry that's hanging around her neighborhood, and she saved her husband by making him hide in a bunch of corn shocks, basically, and it brought him food after dark every day. I think it says how long, isn't it? For like a couple weeks?
Yeah, something like that.
3 weeks or something like that.
Because they were going to conscript him, make him come with them, and
it's interesting to see Wendell Berry use quotes around rebel too, because it's like that reminds me of Girl in the Window, just this like group of rebel soldiers who are, I assume from the apostrophes that or from the quotes that it's not the best group, or they're a wily group of almost like mercenaries or something.
Or the bunches, remember he kept using the word bunches, like the bunch of violence that became permissible within the context of the war.
Yeah.
Do we have an entry in the John notices a lot of a word segment of the show for this story?
Yeah, we do.
Do we?
the word country.
Okay, nice.
At the very beginning, Let's go
That's
back my one contribution to literary criticism.
We need we need a little jingle for it or something.
Yeah, we do. Da-da-da-da-da.
John notices a word.
Yeah, no. So in just the first several paragraphs, I count. So let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 paragraphs. I count the word country 9 times.
Yeah. I can see it, and especially those first 2 paragraphs. I mean, it's just over and over.
And I'm not sure. I think as a writer, I spend a lot of time trying to not repeat the same word. And Wendell Berry, in some of these, he just goes in the opposite direction. He's like, I'm going to keep using this word.
Yeah.
Well, I guess the effect here is he's talking about the country that he's living in, the place he's living in, but also the country that he remembers and his own memory and the sort of cultural memory of the community and his family that lives. So, I think he uses the phrase "the country of his mind," right? That's that memory that goes into making up our experience of a place.
Yeah, I think you're right.
I like that a lot.
So there are a lot of things that I would ask Wendell Berry if I had the opportunity, and maybe, who knows, maybe we will have the opportunity someday. But here in the first 3 stories chronologically in the Port William fiction, he has given us 3 stories of strong women.
Yeah.
And at least 2 of, I don't know when The Hurt Man was written. I can't remember when that first appeared. But the first and third, The Girl in the Window and now Fly Away Breath, those are written relatively recently. And I would ask Wendell Berry if I could, if that's intentional. Like, as he goes back and fills in the early history of Port William, is he intentionally bringing out the stories of these strong women who may not be as represented in some of the earlier stories in terms of when he wrote them? The stories he first wrote. I don't.
And also, Hannah Coulter being his latest novel that he wrote. I mean,
Yeah, that's right. Definitely one of his most recent. And I wonder if that corresponds to him. I feel like he's also as a person is trying to deflect more attention off of himself and onto his daughter and the work that she's doing with the Berry Center and the farming program. And I feel like he's trying to bring Tanya forward, like as he did in the documentary, to say Tanya's been my partner in all of this.
Yeah.
Deserves some recognition. I was told once that if I wrote to Wendell Berry, that I should also address it to Tanya. And this was 2013 or 2014, because he sees her as a partner in all this and felt like maybe she was overlooked.
yeah.
So anyway, I wonder if there's a correspondence there.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like they say, over certain decades of time where like you have these big perspective shifts, and it's he maybe had one then, or just not that he hadn't felt that earlier on, but just kind of like a new awareness where that was what was like at the front of his mind, and we get to benefit from seeing that at the front of his mind here at the end of or in his later career.
Well, and I think it's even, I don't know, I feel like it's even more stark in this story. I mean, we basically, I feel like he describes the Daw family as a matriarchal family, right?
Yeah, you're
like
right.
she has
And she's kind
the
of a
authority. I mean, I'll read from
Yeah.
page, maybe page numbers are irrelevant. It's page 17 in That Distant Land, but
A place and time.
Place and time. Thank you. The rest of her children were daughters, 4 of them. Her grief and her bearing in her grief gave her a sort of headship over daughters and husband that they granted without her ever requiring it. When a certain superiority to suffering, a certain indomitability was required, she was the one who had it. So she's the one in the family who is most able to sort of weather problems and grief. So she is sort of de facto the leader of the family, and I think that's great that we're seeing that in a Wendell Berry story.
Yeah, this character is definitely, you get the feeling that it's a larger than life figure within the family, because she's described as just being so. I mean, just that the talk of her like going out in the field.
She kept the field.
She
right?
kept
like
the field
she
just as she
the
kept
farm,
the
yeah.
home, and she just was this.
And she shot a guy in the ear.
Yeah, she shot his ear off just because he wouldn't die. Right. Yeah. So that
he could tell about it.
Yeah. So that he could live.
It.
So he could survive to tell about it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, because we see that.
How do we miss that?
Not only did her son die, Galen was the one killed, but her husband died right after the Civil War.
Yeah.
And so she's been a widow for over 40 years and has raised these daughters, is well known in the community. She is like a very courageous, powerful woman. And there's something I actually wanted to bring up last time we talked about those 2 short stories. And I can't really get into it now, but I really want to interview this theologian named Ellen Davis.
Yeah.
Ellen Davis wrote a book called Scripture, Culture, Agriculture, and Wendell Berry wrote the foreword. Growing up in the Christian culture I did, like we had a particular interpretation of Proverbs 31. Like the Proverbs 31 woman was kind of like held up as this standard for young women. It was, I don't know, like if it was painted, it was in pastels, it was kind of demure and pure. And Ellen Davis, through her agrarian theology of the Bible, flips that Proverbs 31 on its head and shows that the woman in Proverbs 31 is described as a valorous woman, and that if you read between the lines of what's happening there, you can imagine a woman whose husband has been conscripted by empire to go fight in the emperor's wars. And if the family if they're not able to keep up the farm, they will lose and continue to pay their taxes. They will lose their farm. And so, even in the midst of the struggle against empire, the woman keeps the farm going, and she totally changed how I read Proverbs 31. And man, I feel like those are the three women that we meet in these three stories.
Yeah, for sure.
absolutely. Yeah.
That's a great point. I'd like to read that and hear her talk about it.
Yeah, she did an episode, one of my favorite episodes of On Being with Krista Tippett. She was interviewed on there, and then Wendell Berry read some of his poems in between.
Yeah, I got to see
I'd love to have her on.
I got to see her with Wendell Berry in Nashville speak. It was pretty great to have them talking together. Yeah, that was great. And I mean, I even think it's important and interesting that the family members around the deathbed are all women, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we know that that Maxie only had daughters, but we don't know that she only had granddaughters, right? So, and like, where's Matt Feltner? Like, it's only the daughters around the deathbed, and in this really sacred time. And I mean, I guess probably shouldn't read too much into that, but that's an important duty in the family. I don't know, and I read that sort of through the lens of the line in the manifesto, Mad Farmer Liberation Front, to listen more to women than to men, right?
Yeah, he says, do you mind if I give the whole line?
Yeah, do it.
Because we were just talking about this last night as a household. That's my favorite poem, and that's my favorite passage in that poem. He says, "So long as women do not go cheap for power, seek to please women more than men."
Yeah. And I think that's partially because, I mean, what has the work that, in a lot of cases unfairly has fallen almost exclusively to women has been sort of the caring work of the family, right? And I think what Wendell Berry is doing is holding that up as important work for anyone to do in a family. And the fact that it's only women here is probably historically appropriate. But I sort of read that as this is really important work that a family needs to do for one another, that a community needs to do for one another, and we can all learn by what's going on here.
And I wonder if what he's describing, in terms of her caring for the farm. I remember it seems like there's probably a lot of historical accuracy to that because of just the sheer percentage of men in, at least in the South, who were killed in the Civil War. And I don't know, I know Kentucky wasn't part of the Confederacy, but I haven't seen those statistics, but it was just so devastating to the whole community because so many of the men were dying.
Yeah,
I don't know. I say that as a Yankee. I'm not sure what my.
It's an interesting thing. I was just thinking then this has got what you just said got my brain moving in the. My classes are talking about the American identity, like the like complicated paradoxical mess that is the American identity, and we talked a lot about the frontier being a time that sort of like established a lot of the tendencies that Americans have. But then one thing we didn't talk about enough, I'm realizing, is the Civil War and this time and what we're seeing through these characters. That I think that those struggles and that conflict reflecting 150 years
right
into the future. That I just didn't think about how. And I'm also saying this as a dude, but like wondering from a feminist perspective, like what this time period and that struggle that they had to deal with because of all the mess that all these guys got into with the Civil War and all of them being off and fighting. What kind of a reflection that had on the future of finally catching up to where we are now as far as women's rights and women. Like the liberation movement of the 20th century.
I mean, I think what a story like this shows is that it was always there, like obviously the ability and the drive to even and the ability to do it even better than the men were.
Yeah, right.
The men were doing it right.
Nothing has changed.
Yeah,
right.
Exactly.
That's still the case.
Yeah. Man.
Well, anything more for this story before we move on?
Well, I've been saving a just very unrelated reference to this story.
Three Amigos?
It's not Three Amigos.
Okay.
No, I'm sorry.
Okay.
But I could not, I laughed out loud when I was reading the part, not just because it was funny writing, but like where she sort of gasps and goes, "Ooh," and like, they're sort of startled by it, and they all jump back. And I was sitting here trying to Google it a minute ago, but I was trying to find a story that was on NPR of this zoologist who is an expert in orangutans. Have you ever heard him interviewed?
Mm-mm.
He's been on a few times on like different programs, but he tells this story at some point, and I need to find it. Of he works at this conservatory, or what do you call it? Not conservatory. It's for music. Conservancy. Maybe that's it. And I think it was in Florida or something. But he's there, and he was dealing with orangutans, and he was not like the head guy at this point. He was just kind of the one who got all the odd jobs. And he was called by, I think it was Florida State University or somebody who said, "Hey, you had an orangutan die recently. We need that body for study." And he was just kind of dreading it. He's like, "Oh crap, okay, I guess I got to do this." And so he went out and dug it up, and he was digging up this orangutan, and finally got down. It's like, of course, it was like midnight or 1 a.m. by the time he got down to the bottom, and he picks the body of the orangutan out of the little coffin they made, and he picks it up. And when he picks it up, its jaw opens up, and all the gases released from its stomach. And he said that it just looks right in his face and just went, "Oh," right in his face. And of course, he tells a story of just this foul smelling thing that, and I won't tell you the rest of the story until we're off the air, but of what his response is. But it just I was reminded of that, and I just couldn't stop laughing. But so it just screamed in his face, and he said it was like the scariest thing that's ever happened.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that was the totally unrelated Tim reference that I was really trying not to bring up like 15 minutes ago. So,
Well, we still have one more story to get to Three Amigos, so maybe we'll get there.
I'll see what I can do.
Yeah.
So the next story that we're going to talk about is A Consent, which, as I mentioned earlier, takes place in 1908. And in A Consent, we meet for the first time some of my personal favorite characters. We meet the main character is a farmer named Ptolemy Proudfoot, and this is the story of how he begins to court his eventual wife, Miss Minnie, the local school teacher. And then we also meet Burley Coulter in here for the first time.
Yeah.
And I'd forgotten about that, and I love Burley Coulter so much that when I got to the scene where you see him in school, as a school kid, I just had this goofy smile on my face.
Yeah, that made my day when I got to that part. But.
Yeah. So here, Ptolemy Proudfoot, we see him for the first time, and he's a very tall, very strong man. Comes from a family of big, strong farmers. They wrestle for fun, after lunch. And he's just described as basically so big that his clothes just don't even know what to do with.
Yeah,
he's like,
his clothes are like surprised by him all the time.
Yeah. I also love Wendell describes him as somebody who's just very content that he had 98 acres on his farm, and he never even longed for the other 2 acres to make it an even 100. He was just very content with what he had. Yeah. But he is, I think, 38 in this story. Is that right?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, 36 or 38.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, in his late 30s. Sorry, I can't remember. I didn't write that down. So in his late 30s, not married, but he secretly is smitten over the local school teacher, Miss Minnie, who is in her early 30s and also not married. And she's just this tiny person, especially compared to big Ptolemy Proudfoot. And they, there's a sort of an awkward moment in which they almost literally run into each other at the store, and she says hello to him, and he basically just walks away without saying anything. And the whole ride home, he's trying to figure out, okay, like, what do I say next time we run into each other? And when that happens, he forgets everything that he's been practicing. Just here he's so competent, so big, but just completely flustered over this pretty petite school teacher. And anyway, there's a harvest festival that the school puts on every year, and it's a really big deal. It's a couple weeks before Halloween. Miss Minnie puts a lot of work into it. The students are going to recite poetry and Bible verses, which is weird to think about a little bit. And, the school's decorated and the whole town comes out, and Ptolemy Proudfoot decides that he's going to go. And so he puts on his Sunday best. First he takes a bath, which is a big deal. And then he puts on his best Sunday clothes, hitches up the horse and goes there, and has an awkward moment when he goes into the schoolhouse and he realizes he's the only man inside that's just filled with women.
And he doesn't, of course, he doesn't have children, and so
that's right. Yeah.
he has no
so
other
tall,
reason
he
to be
can't-
there.
Yeah, and he's so huge that it's impossible for him to be unassuming.
Yeah.
He can't possibly disappear, even though that's all he wants to do. And finally it starts, and the kids, as I say, like they recite poetry, and you have this hilarious scene when Burley Coulter is supposed to recite a poem that he's memorized. And then finally the big event of the night is the cake and pie auction. And Ptolemy Proudfoot really is just, no one is going to beat him out in buying the cake that Miss Minnie made. And no one does.
He's kind of
say that.
and he's like flabbergasted by it, like before he even realizes whose it is. Right, like right when he sees it, he's like, "Oh my gosh, it's the most perfect thing." I mean, he knows that it's hers, and it's a wonderful bidding war ensues. But,
Yeah. There's a scene, I wish I had marked it, but there's a scene where he sees this perfect cake, and he almost wants somebody to mess it up, to knock it, to look at it sideways, just just so he could beat them up or something.
Yeah.
It's all happening inside his mind. It's just this really, really lovely way of showing just how enamored he is with this school teacher.
Mm-hmm.
Finally, he wins the bidding war, and Miss Minnie comes over, and he uses that as an occasion to ask her if he can see her home after the event, and she says yes. I didn't. Yeah, go ahead.
I love it. He pays $10 for at the end.
Yeah.
In 19, what is this? 07?
1908. Yeah.
1908.
Yeah.
1908, $10. I mean, that's
That's
an
a
expensive pie. That's an expensive pie. And then I like the other thing about money that comes up earlier is when he walks in and he said, "I would give $45 to be able to leave this room." And he says, "I give $40 or maybe $45." So then every time it comes up, he says both. He says like, "It'd be $40 or $45 or whatever anybody wants." I just wish there was someone here I could give this money to so they could leave.
Yeah, and there's a lot of I don't know. I'm sure there's a better influence to find, but I just feel like a lot of Mark Twain in the way this is written, right?
That's a good call.
It's such a sort of laughable situation, but the language is just this mock heroic language that's
There's a very Tom Sawyer feel to it.
Yeah, and even the poem that Burley Coulter recites, I didn't look up the original to see how his recitation compared to the original.
Yeah.
But it's just very, very funny. And Miss Minnie chose it for Burley because it was masculine. And it starts off, "When the frost is on the pumpkin and the fodder's in the shock." Anyway, it goes on from there, and he messes it up, and she has to give him lines. Finally, he does a very Burley Coulter thing and says, "Well, drawed it, folks. I forgot her, but I'll tell you when I heard." And before he can, do that,
You can tell.
Miss Minnie says, "Okay, thank you, Burley."
You can tell
You can be seated.
he's winding up for some
Some
crude,
there once was a man from Nantucket. Oh man,
that was a really fun surprise to see his name pop up there because I didn't remember that he was in this story. And I'll say I listened to the audio of this story, and the reader does an amazing job with that scene of the interplay, the back and forth between Burley reading this poem and kind of being sheepish, and then and then Miss Minnie kind of coaching him, desperately coaching him along the way. And I love the line. I don't maybe if you have where the poem is, where it mentions the look on Burley's face kind of suddenly changing.
Yeah.
Says, she looked up to see an expression on his face that she knew too well. The blush was gone. He was grinning. The light of inspiration was in his eyes. I love that. Yeah, he's like, I see what I can do with this situation.
And how great! I love it that she sees in Burley all of this potential. She knows that he's smart.
Right.
His reputation will be will be different than that eventually. But
Yeah, I think teachers know that feeling all too well. Like, those kids are like, "You're brilliant, but we'll see what happens with you."
Tim mentioned how well the narrator does. Michael Kramer is the name of the narrator who does That Distant Land. And Tim had this great idea of maybe trying to get him on at some point. Right? And some of the other narrators who do the audiobooks. And I'll just mention that's something we're going to try to do because I think it'd be a lot of fun.
Yeah.
No, they have to have a pretty intimate understanding of the work to have prepared and performed it in such a way. So that would be I just think that would be a fascinating conversation.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Maybe even a couple times if we can convince them to come back. Over the seasons.
What were you going to say, Jason?
I just want to. I mean, I think it's great that Ptolemy and Minnie's names. Ptolemy, of course, goes by Tol, Tol, and Minnie is Miss Minnie. Yeah, I mean, it almost like in all of these stories, like I don't know. I feel like some of these
Tol and Minnie.
Yeah, some of these are some of the best short stories I feel like that Wendell Berry's written.
Jason, I've read this story like 4 times.
Yeah.
I've read this collection, like the original Ptolemy Proudfoot collection, a couple times. I have never thought about the names. And it's right there. Yeah. Right there.
Yeah.
Tall and Minnie.
Yeah.
Love it.
I mean, it's kind of like, it reminds me of like Flannery O'Connor, some of her names for some of her characters, like the Randy Bible salesman's name is Manly Pointer. So it almost gives it sort of this like fable kind of feel. I don't know. I mean, it seems like he is genuinely having fun writing these stories, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, I remember when I was in grad school, a scholar of a lot of Southern literature came to UT, and his name's Ralph Wood. He's done a lot of writing about Flannery O'Connor in particular. And I got to spend some time with him, and I told him I was interested in Wendell Berry, and he said, I love Wendell Berry, I love what he's about, but I feel like his fiction is too thesis-driven in a lot of cases. And I could sort of see where he's coming from and with the novels, and we can maybe discuss that when we get to those. But I feel like in his short fiction, and especially in these stories, these Ptolemy Proudfoot stories, that is absolutely not true. You can tell this is just he's just loving telling these stories about these people, and it has nothing to do with grinding an axe, at least here anyway.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
So Tim, I sent you a text when I reread. I sent you both a text when I reread this story, and I'd read it, as I said, several times before, but by the end, I was so happy that I was actually crying. Like and I was in public, and it just really took me by surprise at how affected I was by it. You had, I think you liked the story, but you were just saying before we started recording that. Well, why don't you describe?
Yeah, and I'm like, I hesitate too because it wasn't like an overwhelming feeling because I definitely did still like the story. I enjoyed it. Mm-hmm. I got a kick out of it. It made me laugh, and it was kind of more on the like traditionally heartwarming side than Barry tends to get. I mean, because of the payoff at the end, especially with the final lines and stuff. Well, of course you can, But the feeling I got is that the story, admittedly, I feel like if I kept reading it, maybe I'd feel differently if I could read it over again. But it felt just a little bit off of being like Hallmarky. A little bit was the feeling I had because it was such like a, or maybe no, actually, I think more fair than saying Hallmarky would be like a Dickens story, like almost like more of like a caricature-y. And I think one of you said something about being like fable-ish or something like that. Like that might have been the connection there. Like that might be a more intelligent voicing of how I felt. That like it struck me not as a bad thing, but just as a different thing. Where I was like, it felt very tidy in some ways. I don't know. I don't want to dig myself in too much of a hole with this because maybe part of it is that this story is, and being one of the later stories, is kind of a gift to people who love Wendell Berry stories. Because one of the ones that he had theoretically written later that I don't know. I don't know if I'm explaining myself well, but it was just I'm purposefully avoiding words like corny because I definitely don't think that.
Right.
But I think that's like what I'm dancing around, is that it was just like 2 inches shy of that.
Yeah.
Which in itself is like an amazing show of constraint and control by a writer to be able to write a story like this that I enjoy, that like my little like antenna, the little meter in my head, the like cheesy meter in my head is like almost there, just enough that I'm really enjoying it, but doesn't quite make it. So, so yeah, that was kind of my
that is the line of crossing over into like sentimentality or something like that is a hard one to toe with this kind of story.
I think the character of Ptolemy himself, of course, is what keeps it back on this side of it.
Yeah.
Because he's just this lovable but like brutish character, and like it's almost like maybe what I'm thinking is that like as I was reading it, the images I was seeing in the story in my head were like Norman Rockwell. What I was picturing. He takes his hat off and his hair is sticking in like every direction off of his head. And, anyways.
There were certain elements of Barry's description of Ptolemy that remind me of what I've heard about Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah.
Really tall, really strong, clothes coming untucked all the time, would wrestle for fun. And so I think, I don't know if I had Lincoln in mind or Daniel Day-Lewis in mind, playing Lincoln as I was reading this.
Well, that would change things. Yeah. Daniel Day-Lewis.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't.
From Lincoln, not There Will Be Blood. From Lincoln.
Yeah. That would be a very different story. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, like, two just like personal things that resonated with me. I mean, number one, I'm 6'2", so moderately tall, and my wife is 5 feet tall. So we're one of those tall and short couples.
Tall and mini.
Yeah,
I'll start calling you guys tall and mini.
Yeah, exactly. Which is great. Also, my wife told me the story of how her parents, who are awesome people, I love them, how they met. Was her dad. They were both a little bit older, probably not quite this old, but a little bit older when they met. Her dad, her mom was still living at home with her parents, and she got into a habit of sitting out on the porch in the evenings, and her dad got into a habit of riding his bike down the road that her mom lived on in the evenings, and this habit carried on for a while before he finally got up the courage to go up onto the porch and talk to her, and, that kind of thing. So
it's a good story.
Yeah.
Here's the passage where he sees the cake for the first time. He says it was an angel food cake with an icing as white and light and swirly as a summer cloud. It was as white as a bride. The sight of it fairly took his breath. It was the most delicate and wondrous thing that he had ever seen. It looked so beautiful and vulnerable there all alone among the others that he wanted to defend it with his life. It was lucky, he thought, that nobody said anything bad about it, and he just wished somebody would. He took a position in a corner in the front of the room, as near the cake as he dared to be, and watched over it defensively, angry at the thought of the possibility that somebody might say something bad about it.
Yeah.
I love it.
Yeah, that's that sort of Twain-like language, this heroic language about this cake.
Yeah, a little caricature-ish.
Yeah.
That's great.
Did you guys notice that the girl who sang after Burley is Kate Helen Branch, who will be their lives will be intertwined for
I did not catch that.
many decades.
I did not catch that.
Yep.
This was a fun story. I think this is one that I can imagine revisiting, just for the joyful moments of it. It stands out. I think it stands out.
Yeah. Well, and it stands out, and we're told it's like a legend in Port William, right? Like
Yeah,
this is
true.
when Tull makes his courtship public, and everyone just always remembers this story because he makes a fool of himself after having only ever barely talked to Minnie.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. Oh gosh, we hadn't talked about the wonderful sweet scene where he's back out in the fields talking to his horses. Going,
Like practicing how to exchange
Saying
pleasantries.
that his like horses and his horse and his dog are looking at him all confused, like, "What are you doing?"
Yeah.
Saying like, well, "Hello there, Miss Minnie." Morning, Miss Minnie. Yeah. And what does he finally say to her when he actually says?
It says he like looks up at the sky and says, "Why, howdy," and he keeps writing. Like,
Why? Why howdy? Yeah, that's great.
I feel like, for anyone who's ever been super awkward around somebody that they liked,
Yeah.
that there's a lot in here that they will recognize.
Yeah.
I was never super confident in that area of my life, of my life, and so I kind of stumbled my way through dating and stuff. One time my mom said, like, "Johnny, does she have to hit you over the head with a 2x4?" And then, yeah.
Yeah. I'm there as well.
Yeah, I think you're in good company.
Yeah.
I say that my story of meeting my wife was much the opposite. That I was like sitting somewhere trying to like mind my own business, and then she like barged right in and was like, "Hey, what's your name?" Like started started talking to me. I had been on campus for like 48 hours and like met her immediately. So that was she saw me reading Dostoevsky. What she didn't know is that I was like my 15th attempt at reading the Brothers Karamazov.
Oh, but you look so awesome.
I look so
sitting
smart.
there.
Yeah, it's like, oh
sitting
gosh,
there reading.
page set. I'm about to the point that I can't get past page 80. And that was the time I made it through, though. It kept going, so I
Good.
loved it.
Yeah, it is fortunate that we all enjoy Ptolemy Proudfoot as a character so much, because we have, I think, at least 6 more stories with Ptolemy Proudfoot and Miss Minnie. So that'll be fun. We are going to continue with fiction for the next episode.
Yeah, I think next time we're switching to a different set of characters, back to sort of the Feltner set of characters, but we'll be back very soon to the Ptolemy Proudfoot side of Port William, I guess. But next time we're going to be looking at a short story called "Pray Without Ceasing." It is a short story, but it's almost a novella. It's pretty long, so I think we're going to devote a whole episode to it. And this is I'm especially excited about that. It's the first short story I ever read. Actually, I think the first thing I ever read by Wendell Berry. So excited about that for sure.
And you can find that in That Distant Land, and then it's in Fidelity.
It's also it's the first story in Fidelity.
Yeah, so it's first story in Fidelity, and you can find it in That Distant Land as well as the Library of America edition. So it's all over the place. So I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, that'll be great. Well, thanks for joining us for this episode of the membership. You can follow us on online. We'd love to connect with you there. You can go to our website at membershippod.com. And then we're also on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook, all at Membership Pod. And yeah, I think that about does it for today. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks again, friends, for listening to episode 5 of The Membership. The excerpts read in this episode can be found in That Distant Land and A Place in Time, which were written by Wendell Berry and published by Counterpoint Press. If you like what you heard, please take a few minutes to rate and review us on iTunes. This helps others find our podcast. The Membership is a proud member of the Rabbit Room Podcast Network. To discover other great podcasts, visit rabbitroom.com/podcasts.